So if you don't make changes to your diet, then you're likely to also see a loss in fat mass. If you make drastic changes to your diet, then that's going to be, a whole nother variable, right? Because let's say, for example, someone undertakes a strength and hypertrophy program and they go, I'm going to add all of this extra food to what I'm normally doing, but they don't expend as much in their training session. Then they might actually gain fat mass.
Hi, Mandy. Nice meeting you. Welcome to Evidence Strong Show. If you could briefly introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thanks for having me on, Alex. I'm Dr. Mandy Hagstrom. I'm a senior lecturer and accredited exercise scientist, and I'm currently working at the University of New South Wales in Sydney.
Awesome. I invited you because you are an expert on resistance training, specifically in relation to females. So that's what we will be talking about. And I based this conversation on the paper you have published a few years ago, which is the effects of resistance training in women on dynamic strength and muscular hypertrophy, a systematic review with meta-analysis. So to start it off, if we could orient ourselves, what do you mean by dynamic strength?
So dynamic strength, we kind of use this term because we were trying to focus on movements that might be more applicable to people. So strength can be interpreted in a multitude of ways, including like isometric strength. So, things like a hand grip squeeze where you're not actually doing anything. We wanted to make it more applicable. So dynamic strength means things like a squat, right? Doing a movement. So that's what we interpreted strength to be in this case. So it meant that we excluded all studies that had an outcome that we didn't think met our definition of dynamic strength. Here we were focusing on research papers, and for research papers, they tend to need to have a movement that you can quantify change in. So with these sort of programs that we included when we were analyzing this, they're programs that were designed to get people stronger or get people bigger, or even if they weren't designed around those outcomes, they had a strength training program. So in order to assess the efficacy or how good that program is, we need assessment that we can quantify change in.
Okay, so one more term, you a little bit mentioned it already. Could you clarify what hypertrophy is?
Yeah, okay. So hypertrophy is, just muscle growth or changes in muscle size. So to hypertrophy means to get bigger muscles. Again, that can mean different things to different people, and it can be measured in different ways. That also can, impact how we interpret findings, whether or not we, say, for example, just get a tape measure and put it around our biceps. That can tell us that perhaps the girth of our arm has increased, but it doesn't tell us what that change in girth is made up of. It could be of muscle or it could be of fat mass. Whereas if we look at something like a DEXA scan, that tells us how much lean body mass we've accrued or how much we have, gained hypertrophy. So we use that term here because we wanted to actually look at what muscle gain was being achieved by females following strength training.
So could we hear any examples of what measures were actually used? What measures you have found used in the studies?
Yeah, so DEXAs and MRIs, CT scans, ultrasound is a way that you can measure muscle changes, but at a localized point. So you can look at one muscle as opposed to whole body muscle. People also do use things like underwater weighing or something called a bod pod, but they're really only used, in scientific areas and really small kind of niche things. What's most common, in both industry as well as in research, DEXA is becoming probably the most common because it's highly reliable, it's sensitive, it's safe, it's easy to use, and it's accessible to, members of the general public as well as to academic researchers.
Awesome. So we have some starting points, and now you have scraped all the literature and had a look at resistance training programs that were trying to affect or change or improve either dynamic strength or hypertrophy. So do you remember how many studies did you look at roughly, and how many did you analyze?
Yes, so 24. We had 24 included in the meta-analysis. So initially we screened about 14,000 articles, and then they didn't meet our criteria for a number of those reasons that I just described. They used a different outcome of strength or a different way of analyzing size that we didn't kind of deem, as acceptable for answering the question as the kind of methods that we did choose. So we ended up including 24 studies, all looking at dynamic strength or hypertrophy. The key here is in these studies, they had to have a control group as well. So what that means is we had one group who undertook the intervention and another group who didn't. And this is best practice because it allows us to compare an intervention with, you could just say, stable baseline. design. And people might think, well, why do you need these people doing nothing? Like, why does it matter? And it matters because things occur over time, right? Like, even if we think about seasonal fluctuations, you think about the hibernating body, the winter bod, people eat more in the winter. If they have, more calorie intake, perhaps they hold more mass. Perhaps people, when they approach summer, they train for different things. They become more aware of stuff because they might be getting into a bikini and care about it. So all of these things over time actually do impact people's behaviors. So by having a control group, we managed to remove that variability in what happens in the wild, so to speak, and then can kind of compare to that. So this was realistically, it's a super basic study design or study question. Does strength training improve strength and hypertrophy in females? And, to be honest, it's so not rocket science, but no one had answered that question yet, which blew my mind that no one had synthesized that literature with respect to sex being a variable that they've considered in isolation.
Okay, so hard question now, why that is, why no one had pulled these studies together before?
Do you know what? It is a really complex question. And I think a lot of it comes back to, sociocultural norms. For a long time, strength training wasn't really acceptable for females. It wasn't something that was done. Even in elite athletes, it was, it wasn't done until a lot later. And even then, it was only done with the highest level of elite athletes. It certainly wasn't something, you would have seen in a fitness center, a few decades ago. It wouldn't have been super common practice for females to be in the free weight area. Yet now it's often equal when you enter facilities. So at the time of this review, about 5 years ago, I think, people still hadn't really started questioning a lot of the, the sex differences in the basic questions. People were starting to ask physiology questions and running studies to get those unique differences between male and female physiology in terms of exercise performance. But we hadn't started at the basics. It's like we jumped 2 or 3 steps ahead. So when we ran the study, we actually didn't know why. So then what we decided to do is we actually ran a few studies kind of in the subsequent years, looking at, who's authoring this research? How's it getting disseminated? And so in a recent study, I think this was last year, my team, we published a large-scale piece of work where we audited all of the governing body resistance training and strength training recommendations. So I'm talking about ones from ASCA, UKSCA, ACSM, all of the big names. And we took all of their recommendations on how to perform strength training. We went to their evidence list, we went to their reference list, and we pulled out every single study from every single review, hundreds and hundreds of studies. And then we went to each of those studies and we had a look at how many male and how many female participants were in them. We then had a look at who'd authored these papers or who'd led the research, so who was the senior author. And what we found was an overwhelming majority of the literature included in these guidelines was drawn from male data. So in both the adult and the youth guidelines, 70% of data was drawn from males. And the vast majority of the researchers of the consensus statements were males or were led by males. And so this has led our team down another kind of rabbit hole that we're still in at the moment, collecting data, and we're trying to understand, do we ask different research questions by gender? Is our gender influencing what we ask and how we research? And then is that having the impact on the field? Because at the moment, we look at that data and we know there is research on females out there. We know there is. Why isn't it in these guidelines? And why are these guidelines not even mentioning, we don't know if there are sex differences in how we should program? Because the thing is, there's just not the data. If there was the data that showed this is equal to that, males are equal to females in X, Y, or Z, then that data should be presented in the guidelines, and it's not, because we are drastically underrepresented. So, there's a whole host of issues here, I guess, systemically in terms of how and what we're researching. And then, my hunch now is it comes to who's doing the research and how's it maybe getting funded. And when these sort of papers come about, why are there only, 9 male authors, for example, right? Surely there's a viewpoint that can be represented by being more inclusive. But that's something that we're kind of not there in terms of being able to answer yet.
So do you think a part of the problem is the famous saying that, females have menstrual cycle, which messes up with everything. And that's why it's just easier to not do research on females, because we don't have to take into account in physiology, hormones, all that. take into account the cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that's part of it, is that, it's too difficult, so we won't do it. But I mean, even just sort of, I think that in some ways is a little simplistic, because the research ecosystem, at least here in Australia, is really complex, and it has a lot of parameters that are a little bit stupid. For example, we have set KPIs that we must achieve, right? You must publish X papers, you must achieve this metric or that. And the thing is, if we want to conduct high quality female physiology research, we often need repeat measures at both high and low hormone phases if we want it to be high quality and include female physiology from a cyclical standpoint rather than just sex or gender. And if we do that, then what that actually means is, to answer a simple question, we often take a lot longer. So I can give you an example from a question I'm currently trying to ask. And what I'm looking at the moment with a couple of students is I'm looking at the effects of the menstrual cycle phase, so high or low hormone, on our accuracy in using the Repsin Reserve or RPE prescriptive framework. So what I'm doing here is I'm not looking at, does the menstrual cycle influence performance or output? Is it influencing our perceptions of fatigue? Because we know that the menstrual cycle has both psychological and physiological implications, but also affective and mood, alterations as well. So because I want to answer this question, I'm looking at it in a group of naturally menstruating and ovulating women, so people with a normal menstrual cycle, and those on the oral contraceptive pill, because on their placebo pill, they've got a low hormone phase, similar to, the pre-bleed phase in naturally menstruating women. So I've got two cohorts of women here. Because women, even within women, we are so variable. We are different from each other. We're different across cycles. So we need a couple of cycles at a minimum to be best practice. So to get that, because I need a high and I need a low phase to understand whether hormones influence our perception, then I need to do that twice. So I then need to have 2 months where I get two collection points in each month plus a baseline test, right? And that's assuming that this female ovulates each month. If the naturally menstruating ovulated woman happens to have an anovulatory period, which totally happens, then we extend to 3 months for one simple data collection. If I was asking this question in men, do hormones affect outcome of RAR? Well, males have a more stable hormonal profile. I could do it in a week. I could answer this question in a week. That's going to take me 2 to 3 months to answer with females. Yet funders and bosses and our KPIs and research institutes, they don't encounter that, so they don't capture that. So often, you've got academics who are being assessed by these metrics that they don't control, and they're going, well, I need to meet these. It's easier for me to study with males. So I don't think it's necessarily, patriarchal or chauvinistic thing on the behalf of research. It is pragmatic. It is easier and it costs less. Now, I think we have bigger systemic issues that we need to change before we're going to see a really true representation of females across the exercise physiology space.
Awesome. I think it is very helpful. Your explanation is very helpful to understand that it's a complex problem and it will take time to sort it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And just so many facets to it.
Awesome. So I think we have some kind of context around this study and in general research in females. So I think we're ready to go into what have you found? So what were results of the study?
Cool. So the results of that specific study looking just at the effective strength training in females were that on average, so I'm talking just in a general sense here, once we pulled all of the data, on average, females gained about 1.5 kilos of lean muscle mass over a period of about 4 months, a bit under 3 or 4 months. And they gained approximately 25% increases in muscular strength. So, I mean, that's pretty solid, right? If I could have 1.5 kilos gain of lean mass right now, I'd be stoked. It is not insignificant. And I think for people who are perhaps strength training naive or haven't done it before, they don't understand the magnitude of what that will feel like when they get that gain. So, to some, they might go, 1.5 kilos, is that it? I have to do all that work for 1.5 kilos. But in reality, that 1.5 kilos of added lean mass is going to make your activities of daily living easier. It's going to make your lifts in the gym easier. You're going to, obviously, you increase strength, so you can increase the load and volume lifted. So when we looked at whether resistance training led to losses of body fat, we found that just simply participating in strength training with no additive dietary restriction or aerobic exercise led to approximately 0.5 kilo reduction in body fat. And that's separate, right? If you look at other literature, it shows, because people say, oh, if you want to lose weight, go running. If you want to lose weight, do cardio. Cardio is the best. That research shows about 0.5 kilo in losses of fat as well. So what we've shown in our research is it's actually not that different. Plus, you get the gains in lean mass that we showed in our paper before of about 1.5 kilos. So really, strength training, while it doesn't have some of the other benefits of aerobic, obviously don't get me wrong, I'm not saying only do strength training. I'm saying incorporate both types of training because they have different physiological benefits for health, well-being, and performance, but that strength training does also lead to gains that you don't necessarily expect. So if you don't make changes to your diet, then you're likely to also see a loss in fat mass. If you make drastic changes to your diet, then that's going to be, a whole nother variable, right? Because let's say, for example, someone undertakes a strength and hypertrophy program and they go, oh, I'm going to add all of this extra food to what I'm normally doing, but they don't expend as much in their training session. Then they might actually gain fat mass. So we're talking about that strength training can cause losses in fat mass when all other variables are held constant. I mean, there's some interesting literature around protein and protein overfeeding and the effect of that on body composition, but that gets really complex. So I think, the key message here is that if you were to you're not training and then you start training, you're going to get increases in muscle size, increases in muscle strength, and losses in body fat. Now, another, thing to be wary of is that we are all really variable, right? So what you'll find is some people will respond massively and some people not so much. We've even seen, in one of our clinical trials we're running at the moment, it's not a sex-based study, but it's a clinical trial intervention where hypertrophy is a key outcome. Across the clinical trial, we've observed an average of 2.2 kilo gains in lean mass via a DEXA following a 12-week training program, which is pretty big. There were people who lost mass following 12 weeks of personalized training. And the thing is we didn't control their diet, right? So if they weren't eating enough food, then the energy expenditure that they've added has to come from somewhere. So it is important to think about it in a holistic manner too.
Also, I think that's helpful to remember. Okay, important topic. So upper body versus lower body strength development in females. Would you have any comments on that? Because, there is saying that women are weaker in upper body, men are stronger there, and maybe females are a little bit better with lower body strength relatively, of course, adjusting for body mass. Would you have any comments on that?
So in terms of upper and lower body differences, our review did show, different prescriptive parameters might be best utilized for upper versus lower body. But I think one of the key things for people to think about is that, females have a different stature than males. Our body structure is different, and that leads to our differences in absolute strength presentation. Obviously, that's simplistic, right? We've got a whole host of other things like lack of testosterone or lower testosterone and things like that. But in general, women have a narrower shoulder girdle and wider hips, right? So that frame means there's less space here for muscles, smaller muscles, and bigger muscles, which is why when you look at even in a relative context, overall of body weight, women seem to be closer in levels of strength in their lower body compared to males when compared to the upper body. But I also have found quite frequently in training and working with athletes as well as in the literature, when you have a female who's not really done strength training before and you give them an upper body program, they get exceptional gains because they haven't trained before. So, even you think about just culturally, kids at high school, the young men often are thinking, I'll do some push-ups, I'll do this, I'll do that. And they've got a little bit of experience and then they hit the weight room and they mainly focus on their upper body. Females don't. Females tend to choose other exercises, which means when they start training with their upper body, they're often a blank slate, so to speak. So those gains, that starting point is lower, which actually means that they can improve so much more. But what it does mean is when we look at, even a relative per body weight kind of ratio, females often tend to not express as much upper body strength as males. There's other things that account for that too, right? So when we talk about relative, we're talking about compared to your size, whereas absolute is, how much can I lift? I can do 100 kilos. Cool. But if I weigh 100 kilos and I can do 100 kilos, that's really different from relative, where if I weigh 50 kilos and I can still do 100 kilos, right? Females, we have different body composition. We have higher levels of body fat. That means that our actual overall body mass has less muscle mass for the whole, per body mass, which affects our relative ratios as well. So there's a lot of things to consider. A lot of the stuff when you think about, training upper versus lower body, I probably wouldn't overcomplicate it. I wouldn't prescribe different sets and reps or different intensities, but there could be things to consider depending on the movement. And that comes down to, is it a skill-based movement? Is it not? Does it relate to sports performance? Like what's your purpose? Because again, a lot of these movements, we get better strength increases if we're training with the movement in which we assess in, which obviously makes sense, right? But also, a lot of these compound movements, they're hard. And if we don't know how to do these movements, then perhaps doing them more frequently is going to lead to better results. So if you have someone new to lifting and they want a female wants to achieve a good bench press, but they've never done it, it's quite a skill. So it's going to be important to have that in your program frequently, or frequently and consistently, in order to, to make that progress.
Would you have any advice how to adjust or how to think about prescribing training to, let's say, new or novice Olympic weightlifting females? So should you consider that probably the upper body may be a little bit new to exercises and need this reminder of the learning of the technique more than the movements that will involve lower body?
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts on this actually, and they're maybe counterintuitive. In some ways, I think if females who are completely, upper body deconditioned or naive to strength training start lifting, sometimes I think it can actually be technically helpful. So if you think about, teaching an athlete to do a power clean when they're strong, right? You often get a lot of arm pull, yeah? You see a lot of the break arm. Yeah. You don't get that with a strength training naive female because they physically can't do it. So, that lack of traditional upper body strength in some ways is actually advantageous because they've got to get that hip drive because there is no other way that bar is going up, right? So I think that's, I wouldn't change that kind of side of things. The other area though that I probably would focus on is back strength. And this is from a non-research sense. This is now coming from my practitioner, strength and conditioning coach hat. I think, like you mentioned, females often will come in with less overall upper body strength, but that lat strength becomes often the lack of lat strength can become a hindrance in progressing those Olympic lifts because the athlete may have trouble staying over the bar for the right position, right? And they'll pull back because they don't have that lat strength to keep in that position. So I would be adding in a lot of even hypertrophy style programming. So accessory stuff for the lats, the rhomboids, and even traps, but that'll just come with all of the shrugging, right? I don't think you really need to prescribe for that. But some basic back conditioning, I think, would be really beneficial for a lot of, novice lifters when they first come in the gym.
All right, one more question that just came up when you were talking. You mentioned about different frames, so wider hips and then a little bit narrower shoulder girth. How this would influence coaching for Olympic weightlifting?
Yeah, so it's one of a whole host of factors, right? So our stature and our body structure affect how we move. It affects, our biomechanics, but it's not the only thing. So the strength of our stabilizers affects our biomechanics. The laxity of our ligaments and joint, our flexibility, right? And those things combined probably have more of an impact on how you'd coach an athlete compared to the fact that females have wider hips. So, I think often what I've seen when people come to lifting quite new is that the lower body strength, the glutes and the quads, isn't normally the first barrier with females. That's not normally their first stumbling block. That comes later on down the track when they're more proficient, that they then need to, grow their lower body, so to speak. But it's not normally that first stumbling block. Male lifters, often one of their first stumbling blocks is the ability to move through a full range of motion. And that inability to move through the full range of motion, if it was a female or a male, I'd still be addressing that. So I don't think, the morphological differences would change too much. The only other, I guess, practical thing to think about is, when you're teaching where to grip, simple things like that, right? Wider shoulder girdles, longer arms, you're going to grip wider. But again, that's not necessarily a sex specific thing, right? Because you can have a male with extremely wide shoulder girdle and short arms, or shoulder girdle, same length, shoulder girdle and longer arms, which is going to affect grip width. So it's one of those things that I would only consider with an interplay with all the other variables as well.
Okay, and let's bring it all together. So your 3 tips in regard to training, strength training, female lifters or females in general in terms of lifting.
So don't be afraid to train your athlete like you would train a male athlete in the gym. Push them hard. Don't back off because they're a female, because there is currently no evidence to show that that's required. If anything, when you look at the physiological differences, the fact that females, might be more fatigue resistant, you could even, rationalize that maybe females can handle more volume, right? So treat females how you would treat any other athlete. At this point, I wouldn't individualize prescription, or I wouldn't segregate prescription based on sexes. I would individualize based on your athlete's needs, which is what I'm sure most coaches are doing anyway.
Okay.
The second tip I would say is understand your athlete and their cyclical variations. So the menstrual cycle will affect your athletes in different ways, each independently. And I think it's really important for you to know your athlete and know what their symptoms are, whether they're physical or psychological, and when they tend to occur for them. So having an open dialogue with your athletes about menstrual cycles is really important, particularly, starting early and with youth athletes where it can create quite a bit of anxiety. So I think that kind of open dialogue is really important. And then third, be wary of your data. Where are your assumptions coming from? So every time you think, I need to do this because this athlete is a female, is it evidence-based? Is it backed by good evidence? And does it make sense? Because I think a lot of the stuff that's around at the moment in terms of sex differences and training and how we approach athletes, it's just done because it's how it's always been done, right? It's not necessarily done because it's how it should be done. So everything you do, think about why you're doing it and if there's a good justification for that.
Awesome. I'm happy with that. Thank you so much. I have 2 short questions to finish off. The first one is, what is your favorite color?
Oh gosh, my favorite color. So it really depends. Black is my favorite color that I'd wear most overall, but I actually am I like pink. I love pink. It's my color.
Awesome. And the second question is where people can find you on the internet if you want to follow your work or they want to contact you.
Cool. So my X handle or X Twitter is at AD Hagstrom. So ADHAGSTROM. And I can be contacted if it's, a science related matter at my university email, which is m.hagstrom@unsw.edu.au. There's a bunch of stuff you can find if you just type my name into Google that I've written either for the conversation or I've written a piece for the ABC. And there's a lot of mainstream stuff out there where I'm trying to disseminate strength training and what the evidence actually says, to a wider audience. So feel free to engage with that too.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your work and thank you for today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.